Welcome to the Dr. Mudgil podcast. This is episode 157, and we are more than halfway through November. Time is flying. Thanksgiving is next week. It's actually rainy and cold. It hasn't rained in New York in it's been like a record number of days. I don't know the exact number, but it is finally raining today. Oddly, we've had these fires and stuff just from it being so arid here in New York, and hopefully this rain will help with that. But yeah, it is time is flying. Times are strange, and let's just dive right into the contents of this podcast. There's been so much going on in the world, Donald Trump is making numerous cabinet member suggestions or nominations, I should say. And it's funny, as a doctor, I've been thinking about, the Robert Kennedy Jr. appointment. And I think a lot of people have been thinking about it. And I've actually been thinking quite a lot about it. And, what really kind of made me think about this. So this is going to be somewhat of a meandering podcast because I've been doing a crazy deep dive and consuming all sorts of media. But one of the things I have to say is I 1000% agree with Robert Kennedy when it comes to the nutrition, our nutrition, what we feed ourselves, our kids especially. And what really made me think about this week was it was some post I think I saw on Instagram or TikTok, which we'll show you. Isabel will show you the actual post, but it's this in black and white. And it basically compares the U.S. version of Heinz tomato ketchup and the U.K. version of Heinz tomato ketchup. And our version, and this is something you've just been hearing so much in just various media sources in the last few months, but particularly in the last few weeks with Robert Kennedy being scrutinized a bit. It's just that, how we allow all of these crazy ingredients in food here in the United States, like food dyes and all sorts of stuff. And whereas in Europe, they don't. A lot of these ingredients that we use in our foods here are banned. And it's not like it's a different company that's making it. If you look at Fruit Loops in the UK and Fruit Loops here, which nobody should eat. It's horrible anyways, no matter where you eat it. But we have all of these food dyes and a crazy list of ingredients, and in the UK it's a much more consolidated version where they use natural dyes and not these synthetic dyes. And I'm not going to get into all the nuances. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but I'm not going to get into it in detail. But it just had me thinking. But anyways, I saw this post, and the U.S. version of Heinz tomato ketchup has tomato concentrate, distilled vinegar, high fructose corn syrup, salt, spice, onion powder, natural flavoring. So that's us. In the UK, it's tomatoes, spirit vinegar, sugar, salt, spice and herb extracts, and spice. I mean, it's literally a much simpler list of ingredients. And it had me thinking about so many things. Just how these massive corporations have such influence over policy in this country. Because the reason why this stuff exists here in the United States is because there's some crazy lobby and some crazy incentive and some financial incentive for our legislators to say, hey, yeah, you know what, we're gonna we'll let you guys keep using these dyes because it's more profitable for you, it's better for our economy, even though it's so detrimental to our health. And thinking about all of this stuff, just as a total side note, I want to give a shout out to this influencer, I guess he would be called, that I follow on Instagram. His name is Abbew, and he's a former bodybuilder. Still in ridiculous shape, but he's a former competitive bodybuilder, a champion from the UK. Who, just for the last few months, I've just been his content has been coming up on my feed. And I started following him and consuming his content. And he really talks about, you should really only eat natural foods. And, he was a bodybuilder, obviously. So, he would have to consume, he still does, a tremendous amount of protein. But he was basically just saying how all of these synthetic proteins that we eat, whey protein and, the soy protein, the collagen powders, all these protein powders and protein bars and, just protein and everything, protein potato chips and, protein yogurt, how all of that stuff is actually total BS. And he has a token phrase where he says, wake the fuck up. That's his line when he's talking about food. And for some reason, it really resonated with me. Months ago, I actually cut out I used to eat I eat a tremendous amount of protein, like over like 200 grams of protein a day. And I've been doing that for many, many years, probably for the last like 10 or, 12 years, however long I've been on my fitness journey. And as my weight has increased, I've been consuming more protein just to support muscle growth and recovery and that sort of stuff. And protein shakes were a huge part of my diet. So, after I worked out, I'd have like a massive protein shake with like fruit, almond milk, and, like 50 grams of protein. And I would have that with like my meal, my post-workout meal. And, I always felt like really bloated and stuff. And, I was always like questioning, like, if it's really healthy, like, eating all this stuff. Cause, you read any like bodybuilding magazine or follow any bodybuilders, everyone has their own protein brands, or they're, some brand is sponsoring them, or they make their own protein. And, it just seems like, wow, okay, I feel like you lift weights, you really have to, have a protein shake. And it's even like my trainers through the years would be like, after your workout, have this shake. I was a big fan of like these Fairlife protein shakes for a really long time. And my wife would get cases of it from Costco. And, just after I work out, I'd have one of those, or sometimes two of those, and whatever my meal was. And after following this guy, Eddie Abbew, who's basically saying like, what you're consuming is this like product that's concocted in a laboratory. Like the human body is not really designed to consume that. It's designed to consume like just whole foods, real foods. And he's a big proponent of eggs. This guy loves eggs. He eats like a dozen eggs a day. And, so I started kind of changing what I do. So, after I work out, I actually eat like 6 scrambled eggs right after I work out and some olive oil. And then I'll like, an hour and a half later, I'll have like my next meal, which will be like some massive amount of protein with like a little bit of carbs. And then the same thing at dinner. And I've been doing this for months. And I got to tell you, I feel great. I feel like I don't feel bloated. I feel like just as strong as I was. I'm still supporting muscle growth. I'm recovering well. I just feel really, really good. I'm not like that maniacal about it. On the weekends, I'll have like pizza, and, I have chocolate and ice cream, all that sort of stuff, but not every day. Like usually during the week, I'm like, super maniacal. Weekends, I take my foot off the gas a little bit, indulge a little bit with my family. But I really cut. I'm not saying you should do this also. So don't listen to anything I'm telling you to do. I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm just telling you what I'm doing. But I've really felt a difference, following what Eddie Abbew says we should do in terms of diet. So check him out on Instagram. We'll put his tag up. I'll have Ismail just throw it up there, and you can check out what he has to say. He's a gem of a human and just a fun guy to follow anyways. But it kind of brought me back to this, this sort of like Robert Kennedy deep dive. Like no one tells us, like when you're in medical school, you learn absolutely nothing about nutrition. You learn whatever like the food pyramid is. They eat these, whole grains, and like, it's literally backwards, and just having gone through this empirically in my own life, with the fitness transformation that I had and manipulating my diet, it really kind of is upside down. The problem with our diet is there's just way too much sugar in it. Then sugar causes an insulin spike, and it causes a whole bunch of bad shit to happen in our body. And, this Eddie Abbew always says that, we've been lied to our whole lives when it comes to nutrition. And I really, really believe that, humans are designed to consume protein and healthy fats. I really believe that's what our diet should primarily consist of. And then once you're in a lean enough state, carbs are important. I'm not saying you need carbs, but we kind of have to teach our bodies to become insulin sensitive again, because if you're carrying around an excessive amount of body fat, you are most certainly insulin resistant. And insulin causes a whole host of things. Going on another tangent. So when I was looking at the ingredients of the ketchup, ketchup in the UK and ketchup here in the United States, what's notably absent from ketchup in the UK is high fructose corn syrup and corn syrup. Those are like two of the key ingredients in ketchup here. And I was like, wow, they've banned high fructose corn syrup in Europe. And that's what I think a lot of people believe. The truth is that is not the case at all. It actually has nothing to do with health. It just has to do with like some kind of like agricultural like fairness agreement in the European Union, where like, corn farmers, and then like, I guess sugar, sucrose, is made from sugarcane and beets. That's like the primary source of how you get sugar. So it has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with health, you know. And then I started going on a deep dive. Is high fructose corn syrup worse for you than sugar? It turns out, no, they both are terrible for you. You know, the difference between like sucrose, which is table sugar, is that it's 50-50 glucose and fructose, whereas high fructose corn syrup just has like, you know, literally 5% more fructose. So it's like, you know, like 55% fructose and you know, 45% glucose. But that being said, it's all bad for you. But I just kind of like to bring it a little bit more full circle with like how bad sugar is for you. So I looked up high fructose corn syrup, and it's like, you know, it's deleterious health effects. It's the same thing for sugar. So, you know, they're both really, really bad for you. But all kinds of things happen. Obviously, weight gain. You gain a ton of weight when you eat too much of this stuff because you become insulin resistant, and all that stuff gets stored as fat. Heart disease, diabetes, obviously, liver disease. You can get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which we see a ton of now. You know, when I routinely check blood work for my patients who are on like systemic medications, and I'm seeing increased liver function tests all of the time. And you know, when I question my patients about it, you know, they usually say, yeah, you know, I have like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's from consuming too many carbs. Tooth decay, obviously. Gout. High fructose corn syrup can trigger gout attacks by increasing uric acid levels. So if you have gout, be careful. Leaky gut syndrome. High fructose corn syrup, and this is also just high glycemic foods in general, can damage the digestive tract, which allows proteins, bad bacteria, and undigested particles to pass through the bloodstream. Asthma, believe it or not. High fructose corn syrup promotes airway mucus hypersecretion, which can lead to asthma, chronic bronchitis, and other allergy type systems. So the bottom line is it's bad for you. So anyways, as I was saying, I started going on this like crazy deep dive about Robert Kennedy, and you know, and I'm going to get kind of like bring it all full circle-ish, I guess, up towards the end of the podcast, but I would like to ramble a little further. So anyways, when it comes to like nutrition stuff, I think Robert Kennedy Jr. is like right on the money. You got to get rid of, you know, these dyes that are, you know, just not good for anybody, you know, especially our kids. You know, if reducing sugar consumption in general, like, you know, sodas, all that sort of stuff, terrible, absolutely horrible for you. I can't even tell you the last time I had a sip of soda. Must have been like, I don't know, 13 or 14 years ago. It is literally poison. Seed oils, no bueno. And, you know, I know Robert Kennedy Jr. is a big proponent of that. So as shocked as, like, you know, I'm being a doctor, like in the medical community in general, and depending on what media you consume, he's a guy that, you know, seems like he's like really, really, you know, out there, you know, sort of a fringe conspiracy guy. But I will tell you, well, I started doing like a really deep dive here. And what's interesting is, and I talked about this in one of my other podcasts not that long ago, really like depending on what media you consume, it really does sort of inform your opinions, obviously. But the problem is the media is so biased. So depending on like what you read or what you watch, you know, you're only getting like a sliver of the story, and the sliver that you get is editorialized. So you're basically like being told something or information through a subjective filter, which is, you know, obviously going to alter your perception of what you think is, you know, good, bad, right, wrong, that sort of stuff. And so I'm a big fan of, like, you know, long form content, like, you know, really kind of like listening to what someone has to say and, you know, informing your own opinion. It's a lot of work. It's very time consuming and difficult to do that. It's much easier just to read like an article of like the New York Times or the New York Post or whatever, Wall Street Journal, whatever, you know, you read. But I find that, you know, like you're just getting like an editorialized sliver, which is very subjective in nature, of events. And, you know, what I started doing a ton of like during the pandemic is, you know, listening to podcasts. And obviously, like, you know, I'm a big fan of the Joe Rogan podcast. And I think, you know, most of the universe is, well, not most of the universe, but much of the universe, you know, enjoys his podcast. And you could say what you want. I have to say, I have never gotten a subjective slant from any of Joe Rogan's podcasts. It's literally, he's a super smart guy, a very well-read guy, and it's very, very objective. He asks hard questions, but he's also open-minded, and he's like, you know, he sort of listens to other viewpoints and really presents the listener, you know, like hours of content about subject matter. So I would encourage everybody, because it really did change my opinion of Robert Kennedy Jr. I think it's episode 1999. God, I have a lot of work to do when I say that number, but it's a podcast with Robert Kennedy Jr. and it actually is very, very informative. He turns out he's actually quite a brilliant person, super well read, super knowledgeable, and my intrinsic reaction to that suggestion for whatever his role is going to be in the government, Department of Health Secretary or Health Secretary, I forget what the exact title is, but was like, oh shoot, this guy's like, anti-vax, this is insane. And, as a doctor, we're so programmed, and I do believe that vaccines are very important. It's a big part of, what we've done in terms of public health. But there was actually a lot that I was actually never taught and a lot that I didn't know about, which I've learned about a little bit in listening to this podcast, which I'm going to explore further. And the reason why I mentioned that is, a lot of the stuff, even myself, like as a doctor, a lot of the stuff that I know is kind of like regurgitated from another doctor that was regurgitated from another doctor. And it just kind of passes on. But the truth is I never really gave a ton of objective thought. I just read in whatever textbook was that, okay, we do this vaccine at this age, we do this vaccine at this age. But I never really gave that much thought to it. I don't have an opinion either way. I do think vaccines are very important. But, there may be, more information that I'm not aware of. And I'm just trying to approach everything with an open mind. And the reason why I'm saying that is I'm going to bring you back to like the last part of this podcast. And I know I'm rambling a bit, but hopefully it'll all make sense at the end. So I remember during the pandemic, it must have been like, not that far into it. So it must have been like towards the end of 2020. Everything shut down in New York in March. I think it was like March 16th, 2020, something like that. So it must have been like later in that year, like, October or November of 2020. And as I mentioned before, I was one of the only dermatologists that stayed open during like the height of the pandemic. I think there were like 2 or 3 of us on the entire island of Manhattan. And we used to do telehealth visits with our patients during the week. And then I would drive in with my staff on Friday mornings. We'd see patients one at a time, social distancing, spacing our patients out, and just whatever needed to be seen. If someone had an abscess or someone had shingles or someone had something urgent that needed to be dealt with, we'd triage it and I'd see them in person. And when folks started getting the vaccine, I just remember seeing a disproportionate amount of patients with shingles. It was, you see a fair amount of shingles when you're a dermatologist, but I was just seeing every week, a couple of cases, just more than I've ever seen in my life. And I was like, this is so strange. The vaccine, there must be something to do with vaccine and the expression of shingles. I don't know how that works or what, immunologically is happening, but there's got to be some correlation. And I remember talking to some folks about it. They're like, no, whatever, you're probably wrong. It's probably nothing to do with it. But a year and a half after that, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that said, dermatologists and physicians have noticed an increased incidence of shingles in patients receiving the COVID vaccine. And I was like, wow, I literally witnessed this firsthand. So the point of that is, sometimes you got to try to make sense with what you're actually seeing, what your eyes are telling you, than what you're hearing around you. Because like I said, it's so important to come to objective conclusions on your own. And again, that was a crazy, crazy time, as you all remember. And there was a lot of people were very polarized about, okay, you wear masks, you don't wear masks. You can wear a mask when you enter a restaurant, but you can take it off when you sit at the table. You don't need to wear a mask there. And nothing made sense. If you get the vaccine, you're never going to get COVID. It turns out if you get the vaccine, you'll still get COVID. But it won't be as bad as if you didn't get the vaccine. I mean, just literally the story was evolving, and I get it. It was a new situation, something that the world was dealing with for the first time, and, information was coming at us very, very quickly. But it did lead to a lot of logic sort of being thrown out the window. For instance, I never could really wrap my head around. I got the vaccines, like as a healthcare provider, I got the vaccine when it was first available. I think I got it actually early, and then I got whatever the shots were required after that. I never actually got COVID during the height of the pandemic, and I wanted to keep myself from getting COVID. So in my mind was like, okay, the vaccine's going to help me do that. Makes sense. What I never understood was though, if you actually had gotten COVID and you had antibodies to COVID, you were still required to get vaccine and show like your vaccine card to like go to, I think like restaurants were checking it, like sporting venues. You had to, there was this card or this app where you basically have to prove that you were vaccinated. And it didn't matter whether you had COVID or not, like, you still had to get vaccinated. And it never made sense to me because if you had COVID, you have antibodies to it. And I never quite understood why, like, so early on in the pandemic that folks were required to get vaccines. But if someone could explain that to me, I'm listening. Like I said, I'm very objective, but just intuitively as a doctor, that just didn't make sense to me. And so going back to like what I was originally going to talk about with this segment of the podcast, I remember like around that time, it was like, like in the beginning ish of the pandemic, I was seeing a patient and I mentioned to her that like, like for me, it just always seemed odd that there was like a coronavirus laboratory in Wuhan, but the narrative that was being told to everybody was like, no, this came from like the wet markets in Wuhan. It had nothing to do with the coronavirus laboratory. And again, consuming primary media sources where like folks are interviewed, it's like a long format interview. I listened to like a couple of Joe Rogan's podcasts around that time. I was home so much and I had the time to do it. And it was the first time I actually ever listened to his podcast, to be honest with you. I knew of him, I'd see like little clips on Instagram, but I never actually watched or listened to, entire like hours long podcasts. And it was one of the first times that I actually did that. And I remember thinking to myself, like, it was a podcast where it was basically, I guess at that time considered like a conspiracy theory podcast where, or this particular episode where I forget who was on it, but they were basically presenting the case that, this must have come from, the virus must have originated in the, the coronavirus laboratory in Wuhan. And again, like it was really poo-pooed by all like mainstream media sources. And like if you did believe that, like folks thought you were like some kind of crazy conspiracy espouser, like, that you were just nuts. And I remember having a conversation with one of my patients, and this is like, sadly the last time I ever saw this patient, but I remember mentioning to her that, hey, it seems odd to me that like no one's really kind of exploring the possibility that this virus originated in this lab in Wuhan. And she said, well, like, where did you get that information? And I was like, well, so I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast, this particular episode. Again, at the time it was fresh in my mind. And like, she basically looked at me like I was like nuts because I would listen to Joe Rogan. And, that was the last time I saw this particular patient. But I was just kind of going on this like deep dive, like all morning, just like, just kind of going in circles. But I just like Googled, was there any kind of like statement from, our government, basically saying, hey, this is where we think the virus came from. And it turns out that, there's like literally, if you Google that, and I'm sure, you could do the same thing. There's just like this document that comes up. It's the first hit on Google. And it's from like, like the intelligence community website. I forget the exact name of the website, but it's a .gov website. And, it says like unclassified on the top. And it's basically the key takeaways from what the intelligence community thinks about the origins of the COVID virus. And I'm literally just going to read it to you. All right. And I don't know when this came out. I'm sure it says on that whatever website I was looking at, but it's quick. It's a quick little read. And here it goes. Key takeaways. The intelligence community assesses that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, probably emerged and infected humans through an initial small-scale exposure that occurred no later than November 2019, with the first known cluster of COVID-19 cases arising in Wuhan, China in December of 2019. In addition, the intelligence community was able to reach a broad agreement on several other key issues. We judged the virus was not developed as a biologic weapon. Most agencies also assessed with low confidence that SARS-CoV-2 probably was not genetically engineered. However, two agencies believe there was not sufficient evidence to make an assessment either way. Finally, the intelligence community assesses China's officials did not have foreknowledge of the virus before the initial outbreak of COVID-19 emerged. After examining all available intelligence reporting and other information, though, the intelligence community remains divided on the most likely origin of COVID-19. All agencies assess that two hypotheses are plausible: natural exposure to an infected animal and a laboratory-associated incident. And this is kind of the first I've heard of an acknowledgement that, hey, you know what? It might have started in this lab, the coronavirus lab in Wuhan. 4 intelligence community elements and the National Intelligence Council assessed with low confidence that the initial SARS-CoV-2 infection was most likely caused by a natural exposure to an animal infected with it or a close progenitor virus, a virus that would probably be more than 99% similar to SARS-CoV-2. These analysts give weight to China's officials' lack of foreknowledge, the numerous vectors for natural exposure, and other factors. One intelligence community element assesses with moderate confidence that the first human infection with SARS-CoV-2 was the result of a laboratory-associated incident, probably involving experimentation, animal handling, or sampling by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. These analysts give weight to the inherently risky nature of work on coronaviruses. Analysts at 3 intelligence community elements remain unable to coalesce around either explanation without additional information, which some analysts favoring natural origin, others a laboratory origin, and some seeking the hypothesis as equally likely. Wow, 50-50. Variations in analytic views largely stem from differences in how agencies weigh intelligence reporting in scientific publications and intelligence and scientific gaps. The intelligence community judges that they will be unable to provide a more definitive explanation for the origin of COVID-19 unless new information allows them to determine the specific pathway for initial natural contact with an animal, or to determine that a laboratory in Wuhan was handling SARS-CoV-2 or a close progenitor virus before COVID-19 emerged. The intelligence community and global scientific community lacks clinical examples or a complete understanding of epidemiological data from the earliest COVID-19 cases. If we obtain information on the earliest cases that identified a location of interest or occupational exposure, may alter our evaluation of hypotheses. China's cooperation most likely would be needed to reach a conclusive assessment of the origins of COVID-19. Beijing, however, continues to hinder the global investigation, resist sharing information, and blame other countries, including the United States. These actions reflect, in part, China's government's own uncertainty about where an investigation could lead, as well as its frustration the international community is using the issue to exert political pressure on China. So, anyways, bottom line is, wow, this is news to me, like a real, sort of official acknowledgement that, hey, perhaps maybe a 50-50 chance or greater that this virus originated in a lab in Wuhan, which, as I said, as a logical human being, and I think I'm not alone when I say this, it seems highly plausible that a virology laboratory studying coronaviruses in Wuhan, where the first cases of this virus originated, seems like at least should be entertained, that could be where this virus originated. But that was just so shut down during the peak of the pandemic. And if you thought that, like this patient thought of me, you were nuts to even acknowledge that that was a remote possibility. So the point of this is, please take, anything you read, anything that you hear, anything that you see on Instagram, anything that you see on TikTok, try to go to the primary source and make an objective decision on your own. Nothing is all good, nothing is all bad. Everything is gray, and it's up to us to really make the effort to kind of decipher, whether something is light gray or dark gray, or maybe even black and white. So that's where this podcast is ending. In conclusion, I will say, eat less sugar, exercise more, and eat more protein. Those are my takeaways from this podcast. I hope you have a wonderful and restful weekend. They're just ready to crush the week ahead. Let's get it.